My brother stood in front of my father's business partners and said, and I remember this as clearly as I remember most things I wish I could forget, that I was too cautious to build anything worth building. That I was a project manager in my soul, not a visionary. That the company needed someone at the top who could take risks without stopping every 5 minutes to read the fine print. 3 years later, he called me from a number I hadn't bothered to save anymore, and I knew from the first 2 words out of his mouth exactly what the call was going to be. I was parked across the street from Harwick Contracting on a Wednesday morning in October, watching the crew trucks pull out for their morning site assignments the same way they always had, the same way they had when I was 9 years old and my father let me sit on the tailgate during school holidays. The building is a converted warehouse on the east side of Hamilton. Not beautiful, but solid. The way things are solid when someone who cares about structural integrity chooses everything that goes into them. My father bought it in 2001 after 15 years of leasing. He paid it off in 8. I know these numbers because I grew up learning them, the same way I grew up learning what wood shrinkage does to door frames and why you never skip the moisture barrier under a basement slab. These things were as ordinary as dinner conversation in our house. My name is Leanne Harwick. My father named the company after himself in 1989, before he was thinking about legacy or inheritance or what the name would mean to the people who came after him. He just needed something to put on his invoices. He was 27 years old and had a panel van, a phone, and a reputation for showing up on time, which in the renovation industry is worth considerably more than it sounds. He built the business on residential work in Hamilton, Burlington, and Ancaster, and then slowly, carefully, always carefully, expanded into light commercial renovation. By the time I joined full-time at 22, Harwick Contracting had 42 employees, a dozen regular subcontractor relationships that had been running for over a decade, and a reputation my father had spent 30 years doing nothing to damage. I grew up in that business in the most literal sense. I spent summers doing material takeoffs from drawings I could barely read at first, and then could read faster than the estimators by the time I was 16. I sat in on client meetings as a teenager and learned that the way someone describes their kitchen tells you more about what a project will actually cost than anything on the drawings. I did estimating, then project coordination, then operations management. I knew the name of every crew lead, who their families were, which sites ran smooth, and which ones were going to need extra attention 2 weeks before anyone admitted it. This wasn't sentiment. It was institutional knowledge, and it took years to build, and my brother would later decide it was a liability. My father semi-retired when I was 28. This was always the plan. He'd said so for years, and when it actually happened, it was handled the way he handled most things, straightforwardly, without drama. He and my mother went to their place in the Muskokas for the summers and came back in September. He still came in Tuesday and Thursday mornings to drink coffee and talk to the crew leads, because those were his people, and he didn't want to disappear on them. The company was supposed to be shared between my brother and me. My brother would handle business development, client relationships, estimating. I would run operations, contracts, and project delivery. We'd each hold director positions under the shareholder agreement. Eventually, one of us would step up as general manager. My father described this over a dinner table in Ancaster's the year before his 65th birthday. Everyone nodded. No one asked for it in writing, because it was family, and those things get said at dinner tables, and we trusted each other. I wish I had asked for it in writing. The first year went reasonably well. My brother was genuinely good at the client-facing side of the business. Better than me, and I was honest with myself about that. He had a way with people that opened doors. The problem was that the doors he was opening led into rooms we weren't equipped to furnish. He started pursuing multi-unit residential builds, the kind of contracts that required certified trades capacity and project management infrastructure we hadn't built yet. I kept saying this. I said it in meetings. I said it in emails that I still have copies of. I was told each time in ways that were almost polite that I was thinking too small. He brought in 2 project managers from a firm in Mississauga that had recently folded. Neither of them had a background in renovation. One had spent most of his career in commercial tenant fit-out, which is a different discipline with a different client base and different site conditions entirely. I raised this in a team meeting and was told I was being territorial. That word, territorial, was the moment I understood that the conversation I thought I was having and the conversation my brother was having were not the same conversation at all. The shareholder meeting was on a Thursday in January. I had driven downtown in weather cold enough to make the car's temperature sensor flash a warning on the dashboard. My father was in Florida. My brother had described the session to him as routine administrative business, which was what it looked like on the agenda he circulated. Two of our outside partners were in the room and one joined by phone. Maurice Desjardins, who was 78, had known my father since the early 80s when they'd both worked for the same framing contractor and who had a quiet, measured manner that I'd always confused when I was younger for passivity. It was not passivity, I understand that now. My brother presented a restructuring proposal. The operations director role, my role, would be consolidated into the general manager position which he would hold. This would streamline decision-making and eliminate redundancy. He had prepared slides. The motion passed in about 12 minutes. Maurice on the phone asked clearly whether I had been consulted on the proposal and was told the restructuring had been discussed, and the communication had been less than ideal but was being addressed. He asked again. He received a version of the same answer. He said he was recording his formal dissent and voted against. Everyone else moved on to the next agenda item. I sat in the parking lot of that building for 20 minutes after the meeting before I trusted myself to drive. I called my father from the car. I told him what had happened. There was a silence long enough that I checked twice to make sure the call hadn't dropped. He said he would call my brother. I found out later that my brother told him the change was something I had agreed to, that the whole thing was a miscommunication that had already been resolved. My father chose to believe this. I don't blame him for it entirely. He trusted us both, which was the right thing to do and also, as it turned out, the wrong thing, and those two things were true at the same time. I took a contract position with a construction management consultancy in Oakville 6 weeks later. Then a longer engagement with a commercial property developer in downtown Toronto. I got my PMP certification on evenings and weekends, reading at my kitchen table until I was too tired to hold the textbook straight. I learned capital project governance at a scale Harwick had never operated at. I learned procurement frameworks and subcontractor compliance structures. I learned how to read a set of financials the way my father used to read a job estimate, line by line, slowly, looking for the thing that doesn't quite fit the pattern of everything around it. I told people I had decided to pursue different opportunities. I told myself the same thing. It was mostly true. The part that wasn't true was the part where I pretended I wasn't keeping track. My cousin Corinne had worked in accounts administration at Harwick since before I joined full-time. She is my father's sister's daughter, and she called me every couple of months to talk about her kids, her garden, a new restaurant she'd tried in Westdale. I always listened. I never asked about the company directly. Corinne had a habit of mentioning business things in the middle of personal conversation, and over time I came to understand that this was not accidental. The first mention, about 14 months after I left, was that the company had drawn against a line of credit secured by the Barton Street property. The equipment yard my father had owned outright since 2007, which had never had anything borrowed against it. The second mention, 5 months later, was that two crew leads who'd been with the company for over a decade had both resigned in the same quarter. Their replacements were younger, cheaper, and had been referred through someone my brother had met at a networking event in Burlington. The third mention, and Corinne said this quietly, in a voice that told me she wasn't sure she should be saying it at all, was that there were unpaid invoices sitting with a framing subcontractor in Stony Creek who'd done work for the company for 12 years and was now consulting a lawyer about registering a construction lien. I did not call my brother. I did not call my father. I did not do anything that could be interpreted as interference, or worse, as the behavior of someone who was still bitter about a shareholder meeting 3 years earlier. What I did was begin tracking the company's public records, Ontario's business registry, CRA filings, provincial court records for contractor disputes, the WSIB employer compliance database, which is searchable in public and which most people never think to look at. All of it freely available. All of it, taken together, beginning to tell a story. What emerged over about 5 months of evenings built itself in pieces. 2 registered construction liens, one from that framing subcontractor in Stony Creek, and one from a drywall supplier in Burlington. A WSIB compliance notice related to underreported worker hours on a multi-unit project in Brantford. The kind of notice that signals either administrative carelessness or deliberate underreporting, and either way signals something wrong. a lapsed commercial general liability certificate that had left the company technically uninsured on an active worksite for a period of approximately 6 weeks. The insurance gap alone could have ended the company if anyone had looked at the right moment. And then there was one more thing. A CRA business number amendment that had added a secondary operating entity I had never heard of, registered to a mailbox address in Oakville, under a name that had no history I could find. I brought that last piece to a woman named Anika, whom I'd worked alongside briefly during my time with the Toronto developer. She was a forensic accountant with the kind of methodical precision that makes other careful people feel approximate. I asked her to review everything publicly available and legally accessible. Nothing more, nothing proprietary, nothing that could be construed as obtained through any improper means. I wanted whatever she found to be unimpeachable. She came back to me 6 months later with a binder 3 inches thick. The secondary entity, a company called Nortland Build Solutions, had no registered employees, no verifiable physical address, and no demonstrable trade history in the construction industry. What it had was a series of subcontract invoices totaling approximately $2.6 million over the preceding 20 months, every one of them paid by Harwick Contracting. The payments had been authorized under a single signatory arrangement, my brother's signature alone, which had been possible because the dual signatory requirement in the original shareholder agreement had been quietly amended away 3 months after I left. Through a board resolution passed without Maurice's knowledge, and without the formal notice period the agreement required. Nortland's corporate structure connected, through 2 layers of numbered companies, to a personal holding entity registered to a man named Lance, who had been my brother's university roommate, who attended the same industry networking events my brother attended, and who had no traceable experience in construction subcontracting. It was not theft in the way most people picture theft. There were invoices, there was paperwork. The payments were spread carefully enough across months that any single one might have looked unremarkable to someone reviewing only one period's expenses. What it was a slow and deliberate misdirection of company funds, structured to survive casual oversight and fail a thorough one. The arrangement had worked because no one thorough had looked. I was about to change that. I did not call my brother. I did not call my father first, though I thought about it every day for nearly 2 weeks. I thought instead about Maurice Desjardins, who had voted against my removal and had said nothing public about it in 3 years, and who I had come to understand was not passive but patient, in a way I was only beginning to recognize as something to aspire to. I called him on a Saturday morning and asked if I could come by. He made tea and put it on the table without asking whether I wanted any. He read Anika's summary in silence, turning pages with the deliberateness of someone who has spent a long time reading documents that matter. When he finished, he set it down, took off his glasses, and looked at me across the kitchen table for a moment. "Your father doesn't know yet," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "Does your brother know you have this?" "No." He put his glasses back on, picked up his phone, and scheduled an emergency shareholder meeting for the following Wednesday. He told me I didn't need to be there, that he would handle what needed to be handled. Before I left, he looked at me for a moment and said, "You got patient. That's harder than most people make it look." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said thank you, and I meant it more than it probably appeared. Corinne called me Wednesday evening. She had been in the building and had seen some of it through the glass before Maurice had asked administrative staff to step out. She told me Maurice had spoken for close to 40 minutes in the steady, unhurried voice of someone who had been thinking carefully about what to say and for how long. The outside partners had listened without interrupting. My father had sat at the far end of the table and had not moved. When the meeting ended, both outside partners had formally requested my brother's resignation as general manager, pending an independent audit. My father had asked once whether the documentation was verified. Maurice had said it was. My father had nodded once and not spoken again. My brother came to my apartment 4 days later. I hadn't expected it to be so soon. I heard the lobby buzzer and stood in my kitchen for a moment before I answered it, because I already knew who it was, and I needed a moment to decide how I wanted to be in the room with him. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. My brother is 3 years older than me, and has always carried the particular confidence of someone whose plans haven't failed badly enough to leave a mark. That confidence was still there when he came upstairs, but it was thinner than I remembered, like a coat that no longer quite fits the person wearing it. "You've been building toward this since you left," he said from my hallway. He said it like a fact he'd finally worked out. Not quite an accusation, more like a man searching for a version of events he can live with. "I've been working," I said, "the same way I was working when I ran operations at Harwick. The same way I was working when you told the partners I was too cautious to lead anything worth leading." I didn't phrase it exactly like that. "I was sitting 6 feet away from you," I said. "You phrased it exactly like that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said whatever had happened with the finances could be explained, that there were reasons for the Nortland arrangement that were more complicated than they looked on paper, that context mattered. I told him I agreed that context mattered, and that was exactly what an independent auditor would be spending the next several months determining, and that neither of us was in a position to influence that process anymore. He tried another approach then. He talked about the crew. He said 43 people depended on the company continuing, that pulling it apart over old grievances would hurt people who had done nothing wrong. I told him I agreed with that too. It was precisely why I hadn't called him screaming 3 years ago, and hadn't contacted the business press, and had brought what I had to Maurice instead of anywhere else. The people who worked there were the reason I had waited for the right moment, rather than the most satisfying one. "You were always better at the operations side," he said, after a silence that had gone on long enough to make the apartment feel smaller. He said it without edge. "I'm not saying that as an insult." "I know," I said. "I said it to you 6 years ago. You took it to the partners as a character flaw." He left without saying anything after that. I stood in the hallway for a while after the door closed and felt something settle that had been unsettled in me for a very long time. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the absence of weight I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying. The audit took 13 weeks. What it confirmed mapped onto Anika's review with a precision that was almost exact. The difference was in the documentation of a small number of additional irregular disbursements that hadn't been accessible through public records alone. Nortland Build Solutions was deregistered before the audit's public findings were formally released. Lance had already resigned from every entity with any connection to Harwick before the first week was out. A civil suit his lawyer had initially floated, something loosely framed around defamation, which Maurice described to me calmly over the phone as a standard intimidation tactic, was withdrawn without explanation inside a month. Anika said, without any particular surprise, that proceeding would have required producing more financial documentation than anyone involved had any interest in producing. The consequences moved faster than I had expected once the auditors were done. 2 of the long-standing subcontractor relationships that had gone cold during the previous 2 years were rebuilt within the first month. The construction lien filed by the Stony Creek contractor was settled in full once the working capital picture clarified, and the bank had enough verified information to authorize a short-term facility. Employees who had been quietly updating their CVs, and Corinne said there had been quite a few, began to stay. Corinne herself was promoted to accounts manager, which she had earned years earlier, and which I would have done on my first day back if I'd had the authority. My brother retained his shares, which wasn't something anyone could easily undo without extended litigation. But he signed a management exclusion agreement and has had no involvement in daily operations since. The partners offered me the general manager position, 8 weeks after the audit closed. Before I accepted, I had one condition. The succession framework my father had described over dinner in Ancaster needed to be formalized in the shareholder agreement with a unanimous vote behind it, not kept as a memory of a conversation over pasta. Maurice drafted the resolution himself. He made sure the dual signatory requirement was fully reinstated with no amendment mechanism that didn't require full partner approval. He made sure my director position was restored in the corporate registry with no qualification. He retired from the board 3 weeks after it passed and said he'd been meaning to do it for 2 years. He said he just wanted to see one more thing through first. I moved back into the office on a Tuesday morning in February. The building looked the same from the outside. Inside, it smelled the same. Lumber and concrete sealant and whatever cleaning product they used on the floors, a combination I couldn't have described to anyone who hadn't grown up around it, but would have recognized anywhere in the world. I stood in the operations room for a moment before I started the day and looked at the scheduling board on the wall. 3 of the active contracts were projects I had helped estimate before I left. The first year back was not dramatic. It was process and paperwork, and one very long conversation with our chartered bank about rebuilding the credit relationship on terms that didn't leave the Barton Street yard exposed. It was implementing a monthly financial reporting structure the board could actually read and understand. It was sitting with each crew lead individually and listening for a week before I changed anything at all. By the end of that year, the project completion rate was back to the numbers my father had maintained through the 90s. The line of credit against the yard had been reduced by more than half. We had brought in 3 new subcontractor relationships and renewed 2 long-standing ones that had gone quiet. I reported all of this to the partners in plain language with the numbers behind it. I did not make it into a story about myself. My father came in on a Tuesday in the spring, later than his usual time, and walked through the operations room without stopping to talk to anyone. He read the job board carefully. He looked at the scheduling grid on the wall. He stood at the window that looks out onto the yard for a long moment without saying anything. When he turned around, he said, "The Holbrook project, the one out in Dundas. Is that the Henderson crew?" I told him it was. He nodded. "Good crew," he said, and then he went to get his coffee. My brother was at my father's birthday dinner in August. We were at opposite ends of a long table, and we didn't speak. At the end of the evening, when people were putting on their coats and saying their goodbyes in the front hall, he caught my eye across the room. He didn't say anything. He nodded, once, the kind of nod that doesn't ask for anything in return and doesn't offer anything either. I nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't reconciliation, and I didn't need it to be either of those things. It was just 2 people acknowledging that they had been in a room together and were now leaving it. My brother once told a group of partners that I was too cautious to build anything worth building. I have had a lot of time since then to think about what he meant by cautious and what he imagined building required. What I know now is that the things most worth building are exactly the ones that take the longest to get right, and the ones that hold longest when the person who stopped being careful finally has to hand them to someone who is. The job board in the operations room has 14 active contracts on it this week. The morning trucks pulled out at 7, sames as always. The grain of this place hasn't changed. Neither have I. I just finally have the room to show what was true the whole time.